Hola, buenos días. Perdón. Bienvenidos a la octava edición de la LEF, Festival de Arte y Ciencia que organiza la Coordinación de Difusión Cultural. Queremos dar la bienvenida al doctor Brian Patrick Green, director del Centro de Tecnología Ética de la Universidad de Marcula. Gracias a ustedes también por acompañarnos, también gracias a la Facultad de Derecho.
La ética de la inteligencia artificial buscando lo mejor, evitando lo peor. Los avances en la inteligencia artificial, los que vivimos todos los días y a los cuales estamos cercanos, están cambiando rápidamente el mundo y lo podemos ver a través de nuestras propias redes sociales y del entorno en el cual nos desarrollamos. Pero estos cambios están haciendo realmente un cambio en el mundo. El buen o mal uso de estas inteligencias comprende consecuencias que a veces no imaginamos y tampoco dimensionamos. ¿Qué está haciendo la ética con la inteligencia artificial? Que justamente de esto nos hablará el profesor Green. ¿Qué se está haciendo con la ética y cómo puede ayudar a marcar una diferencia positiva? Esta conferencia pues enfrentará los desafíos que acompaña la inteligencia artificial y podrá exponer y ayudarnos a comprender un poco hacia sus mejores usos y alejarla de los peores. Y bueno, justo como mencionó Marcela, pues el profesor Brian Green es eticista de tecnología con un doctorado del Graduate Theological Union en Berkeley, Estados Unidos, director de ética tecnológica en el Centro Marcula de Ética Aplicada de la Universidad de Santa Clara, en Estados Unidos, y ha sido uno de los contribuyentes principales en estudios de casos sobre ética realizados por el Foro Económico Mundial con Microsoft, Salesforce e IBM. Además, colabora con el Dicasterio para la Cultura y la Educación del Vaticano y con empresas tecnológicas que van desde startups hasta las más grandes empresas. Es autor de Space Ethics, coautor de Ethics in the Age of Disruptive Technologies, An Operational Roadmap en el 2023, coautor de Ethics y in Technology Practice, autor colaborador de Ethical and Anthropological Investigations y coeditor de un sinfín de números en revistas especializadas de tecnología moral y también sobre inteligencia artificial. Así que bienvenido, doctor Brian Green, y comenzamos esta actividad en el marco de la octava edición de la LEF. Gracias.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your university. It's a great honor to be here. Today we're going to be talking about AI ethics and talking about the theory behind AI ethics, so some of the philosophy, but all the way to the corporations and the very practical side of the way that things are being done in the world right now. So we'll start with theory and foundations. The world is a confusing place. There are many things happening all the time, very hard to understand. But one of the things that human beings like to do is we like to try to understand the world. We try to learn about what is happening in the world, and when we learn, then we can understand it better. So we try to make sense of this confusion. We come up with explanations. Some explanations are better than other explanations. You can come up with an explanation that is not very good. You can come up with explanations that are better. If you're using bad explanations, you tend to have inaccurate view of reality. You will think that you are doing something that makes sense, but if your theory does not match reality, then you end up making a mistake. This becomes very important in ethics because it's one thing for ethical theory to give you an idea of how the world should work, and it's another thing when you apply the theory to reality to see what it actually does to the world. Does it make the world a better place? Does it make the world a worse place? I'm going to lay out some possibilities now. So first thing to know is that ethics is about good judgment. Everyone should know how to make a good decision. Good decisions are the foundation of life. All the time that we're going through life, we have to make decisions. We have to decide whether to do our homework, for example. We have to decide whether to go to a party, whether to call our parents to say hello, all these sorts of things all the time. And you might not think that's a big ethical decision, but the little ethical decisions build up into bigger ethical decisions. So technology empowers people to do new things. At the forward edges of human action, people can act in ways that laws might not cover, but ethics does. So as we are developing new technologies, there might not be a law that is specifically about that technology. So artificial intelligence is a prime example of this. And when you are thinking about this, you can say, oh, it's not illegal. I can do it if it's not illegal. This is the way a lot of people who are developing technology think. That's probably not the right way to think of it, though. Because if you think of it purely in terms of laws, then you start missing the fact that you can do bad things that might be legal, because ethics still applies. Ethics always applies to human action, whether it is happening right now with laws happening, or whether it's happening in the future and the laws don't apply, ethics still applies. One of the very important things right now in society is trust. The amount of trust in society, some research has indicated, is decreasing. People trust the government less. They trust corporations less. They don't trust the way the world is working. And so one of the things that ethics does is it helps to increase trust in society so that people can start being more trustworthy. If you are, for example, acting in an ethical way, you will have a good reputation, hopefully, and that reputation of trustworthiness, of being a good person, will then help to make sure that as you are going out into the world, people will trust you more, and it'll make overall society a better place. And the more trustworthy people that you have around, the more trustworthy society becomes. But there's something that technology does that's very interesting. It's harmful to trust. So technology does not necessarily increase social trust. As a side effect, it actually tends to harm social trust. And what I'm going to do now is explain why this happens. So you can think about the invention of nuclear weapons, for example. Up on the board here, we have something that's called the W-89 warhead. It was developed by the United States a few decades ago. It's 34 centimeters in diameter, just over 1 meter tall, and it weighs 147 kilos and has a 200 kiloton yield. That means it's huge, absolutely huge. If you set this off at the flagpole in the Zocalo in downtown Mexico City, most of the city would be destroyed. When you think about this, you think about the incredible power associated with this technology. This is an example of where you develop technology. More technology means you have more power. More power means you have more choices. More choices mean you have more responsibility. And more responsibility means that you have more need for ethics. In the past, humans were involuntarily constrained by our weakness. In other words, we had no choice. We did not have a weapon like this. And if we do not have a weapon like this, we do not have the choice to use it. However, if we develop the technology, then we have to make a choice whether to use it or not to use it. That gives us a great responsibility to make sure that we use it correctly, or never use it, preferably never use it at all, if we are thinking properly about ethics. So previously, we were involuntarily constrained by our weakness. Now we need to learn to be voluntarily constrained by our good judgment. In other words, we were just stopped in the past because we weren't strong enough. Now we are strong enough. We have to make the choice to do the right thing. This is just a zoom in of what it looks like with Mexico City. All right. Technological power turns constants into variables. So a former constant, there were no nuclear weapons in the world. There was no possibility of nuclear war, no possibility of nuclear winter. Another former constant, there was no space travel. Therefore, there was no choice whether to go to the moon or to go to Mars or to have space debris orbiting the Earth. Another former constant, there was no anthropogenic climate change. So climate change didn't happen. At least it wasn't humans' fault that it was happening. There was no question of climate engineering. Climate engineering is something that's being taken very seriously now, that as the world is getting warmer, we might need to take the emergency step to cool down the climate by filling the atmosphere with sulfur dioxide to block out the sun. And formerly, there was no AI. There were no intelligent objects or things like that. We didn't have to worry about the ethics of AI because AI did not yet exist. However, when a constant becomes a variable, it becomes a choice, and therefore we become responsible for it. There are probably constants that should not be turned into variables. This is the ethical question. Should we even have this technology? Nuclear weapons, for example, give us terrible power. AI also gives us an immense amount of power. And then the question is, should we use the power or not use the power? So how is trust harmed by technology? Constants can be trusted. Even if the constant is not that great, at least people know what to expect because there's certainty that something is solid in society. If you change a constant into a variable, it changes from being something solid to being more like a liquid, for example, or think of it as a phase change, that it all of a sudden you had something that you could trust and it becomes not something that you can trust. So variables cannot be trusted. Even with great opportunities, the uncertainty and risk impedes trust. So when you have this change from a constant to a variable, trust is endangered. You might trust a person very much, but the situation around them and around you and in the world might have changed. So it might be in the past that you could have very reliable understanding of other people, but if the situation changes dramatically, even if you still trust the person, the world might be different, and therefore you might not be able to trust the situation anymore. You can think about this with employment as an example. You might have great trust that someone might have a job. Maybe someone has a job and that's helping you go to school, or you have your own job and that's helping you go to school. You can trust that. But if artificial intelligence comes along and makes jobs, changes them into a different sort of job, or even makes people lose jobs, then all of a sudden you might be the most reliable person in the world, but your job might disappear because the situation has changed. All right, as choices become available, uncertainty increases. That harms trust just by being uncertainty. When you have then choices that are available, some people are not going to make the right choice. That harms trust again. So you give people more power, and then they choose the wrong thing, and that results in even more harm to society. It's a double harm to trust. There's the harm just in the uncertainty, and then there's the harm when the actual bad choice is made. Norm formation and legal regulation can help. And when I talk about norms, I'm talking about ethical norms. And we'll talk more on that later. All right. So this is not the fault of technology. It's not the technology that does this. However, every time a technology is made, it has a certain direction to it. So artificial intelligence, for example, assumes that intelligence is good. And the more intelligence that we have, the better the world will be. Even the idea of a nuclear weapon has some sort of idea behind it that it's supposed to be a good thing, that it's supposed to somehow prevent war or stop people from fighting with each other because war becomes too terrible. It's fundamentally not the technology, it's the artifact itself's fault. However, it has a direction to it. The fact that a nuclear weapon exists means that enormous numbers of people can be killed at once. And so there's a tiny picture of Robert Oppenheimer up here. If you've seen the movie about Oppenheimer, you know that after he developed the bomb, he became very concerned about the way that it was being developed. In fact, he opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb afterwards. However, there is no way to go backwards. Once the technology was created, it's there. So technology developers need to see their role in this. They can be at fault. The technology itself is being used by humans. The humans have that choice, but the technology also gives humans new choices, and those new choices can be very harmful to society. No technology exists independently of society. Therefore, the fault really lies in ourselves. People are not trustworthy, we're unprepared, or we're unethical. And ethics has priority over technology. Every time you see a technology, you should think to yourself, is this a good technology, or is this a good use of technology? And of course, the answer is that we can do better. We can always do better with what we're doing. All right. Now we're going to go to ancient philosophy with Aristotle. Aristotle made a comparison in the Nicomachean Ethics where he says ethics is like navigation. If you want to get from one place to another place, you follow the path that goes between the two places. From X to Y, you follow the path Z. Ethics is similar, but it's much more complicated than navigation. Based on your current situation, whatever that may be, that would be X. Then if you want to achieve Y, which is your good destination that you're aiming for, then you have to follow Z ethical decisions. The thing to really know about this is that the space of ethics is much vaster than the space for navigation. When we're navigating, we're just trying to get around the city. It might be very complicated to get around the city. But imagine all the space that we navigate with ethics. It includes everything that we can possibly choose to do, every action that we can make. So it's navigation of all possible spaces of action. That depends on your power. Some people have more power than others. For example, the President of the United States has the choice whether to use nuclear weapons or not. Vladimir Putin in Russia has that choice. Various other leaders around the world have this choice to use that technology if they want to. However, we don't have that choice. We don't have the same power as individuals. There's a lot of uncertainty that's involved with this also. If you want to think about this mathematically, it's an n-dimensional navigation problem. In other words, we don't know how many dimensions there are. We could probably come up with a number of dimensions, but then we have technology that's expanding the space of action that we can make choices within, and there's also a lot of uncertainty because we can't predict the future. We don't even really understand our own situation right now perfectly. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and for every choice we make, we don't know what all the actions, all the results and consequences might be. All right, so once again, you can think of it as you go from origin to destiny through ethics. This is the simple path, but we don't even have this simple of a world to live in. Because we live in a pluralistic world, and of course this is a simplification even here, it's much more complicated. There are many people around the world who have different ideas of what ethics is. So if you go to China, for example, they have a different understanding of ethics. If you go to other places in the world, they'll have a different understanding of ethics. And so you have many different starting places, many different origins, many different destinations that they're aiming for. What are their goals? What do they want, either culturally or as a government or as individual decision makers? And then there's the ethics that gets you from the start to the end. Is it confusing? Yes. It's not confusing because of AI, but AI just adds to the confusion. All right. So ethics is becoming kind of like rocket science. This is the analogy that I like to use. If you're trying to get from Earth to Mars, you have to realize that you're launching a rocket, a moving vehicle, from a moving planet, the Earth, towards a moving planet, Mars. And then if you want to get back again, everything moves in a different way. You have to go inwards and get back to the Earth. So this is just an example of a sample return mission from Mars. It takes 545 days. But that's just an analogy, right? It's just a comparison to think about. Ethics is becoming like rocket science now. It's so difficult. It's always been extremely difficult. But the more choices and more technology and power we have, the more difficult ethics becomes also. So we look at this and we say, okay, there's too much movement. Everything is changing. What do we actually do? The answer is that there is one fixed point. There's something called the first principle of practical reason. It's very simple. It says, do good, avoid evil. This is something that goes back to ancient philosophy. It's basic. It's so basic that it's like the principle of non-contradiction. If you think about basic philosophy, you go back to Aristotle, the principle of non-contradiction says that something cannot both be and not be at the same time. It's like saying 0 does not equal 1. If you try to have a rational system that does not agree with non-contradiction, it doesn't work. You can't have computers even. You can't have any technology or logic because computers, for example, are built on mathematical logic that relies on 0 and 1 not being the same thing. There's a problem, however, when it comes to the first principle of practical reason. You tell an AI, very simply, you go to an artificial intelligence, and if you tell it something like do good and avoid evil, then the AI might say back to you, okay, what are good and evil? And now you have a really complicated problem. You have to take your North Star, your constant, the first principle of practical reason, and then add content to it. What does it mean to actually do good and avoid evil? There are two approaches to this. It goes back to Greek philosophy. If you've read Plato's dialogue called the Euthyphro, it's about Socrates, and Socrates is talking to someone, and he says, someone named Euthyphro, and says, is good good because the gods love it, or do the gods love good because it is good? And you say to yourself, okay, that's very confusing, and Socrates is very annoying about it if you read the dialogue. It's fun to read, though. So there are two things happening here. If you take the first interpretation, that good is good because gods love it, that's called voluntarism. Voluntarism means that you tell something to do something, and they have to do it because you told them to do it. So I say to the AI, do what people want you to do. Whatever someone commands the AI to do, the AI should do. The other approach is called rationalism. Rationalism is that AI should do the right thing regardless of what people want. And this is an interesting question because this rationalistic approach means that sometimes the AI will say no to a person. Someone will say, and you might have experimented with this, if you use ChatGPT or something like that, sometimes it'll say, no, I can't do that. So you can see how right now in the practice of AI, they're trying to create a product that is both agreeable, it does what you want to do, but also sometimes it disagrees with you. It says, no, I can't do that. This gets into this voluntarism versus rationalism debate. So voluntarism comes from divine command ethics and ultimately from Euthyphro's problem. It solves the dilemma by saying that good is whatever God says it is. So, and if you look at the history of philosophy, at one point Nietzsche says, well, God is dead. And then what happens? If God is dead, if God is not giving the divine command anymore, then the next most powerful organization picks that up, and that's the state. The state replaces God and starts telling people what's good and bad. This eventually results in certain governments that are more totalitarian than others. Of course, totalitarianism's always sort of existed in terms of a monarch commanding things and telling people what to do, but only in the 20th century with Nazism and Soviet communism and communism in China and various other places around the world did we start to see that totalitarian states can be extremely terrible, extremely destructive. And so, based on seeing that in the world, many nations said, okay, we never want to do that again. Take the power away from the state. We're going to give it to individuals instead. And if you give it to individuals, then you don't have this risk of totalitarianism anymore. But you have a different problem up here, which is that everyone starts disagreeing with everyone else about what ethics means. And morality, therefore, risks becoming chaos. Many AI ethicists, I would say, have not figured this out yet. At the theoretical level, they understand it at the practical level, but not yet at the theoretical level. I was at a conference called Neural Information Processing Systems Conference, NeurIPS, which was in December, and I presented a paper there, and every paper there talking about AI alignment was looking at it from the voluntarist perspective. We want AI to do what people want it to do. And I presented one paper on rationalism, and nobody understood what I was talking about. So I'm trying to get better at describing these things. All right. So the last thing I would say here is that good should not depend on the will of the strongest. It's not might makes right. I don't know how that translates into Spanish. Hopefully it sounds similar. But might makes right means that the strongest chooses what's good and bad. That should not be your ethical foundation. If you do that, then it becomes a very dangerous sort of society where it's just powerful people commanding you what to do. So the opposite side of things, rationalism. If you look back at the Euthyphro problem, it's the idea that God loves the good because it is good. This comes from an idea of God being rational, ultimately. It's not just the most powerful thing. It's not because God is powerful that good is commanded. It's because God is rational that good is commanded. So the universe and ethics fundamentally make sense, and I think we can understand this now because we live in a world where we understand that logic operates in a certain way. We know that logic operates well enough that we can make a computer run, for example. We have the scientific method to find true knowledge in that way. It doesn't matter who is in charge or who is most powerful. There's something outside that is the external judge. It's reality. It's the reason that is embedded in reality itself. By the way, you don't even need to believe in God for this to be the case, because we already know, like I said, from logic, from math, and from science, that the rational existence is out there in reality. So once again, going back to the Euthyphro problem, God loves the good because it is good. And in Christianity, this actually is squashed together into one thing. God and good are the same thing. That's the solution from the Christian perspective, that they're actually not separate. They're the same thing. And that dissolves the problem. All of a sudden, this long Platonic dialogue is dissolved. Plato knew that that was the answer, by the way. He knew that even though he wasn't Christian and he existed before Christianity was even a religion, because he understood that ultimately the true, the good, and the beautiful, and the one are all united together. All right. So we have this rationalistic approach, and you say to yourself, is there any foundation for all these things? Are moral facts possible? And my argument, the paper that I presented at the NeurIPS conference, was that yes, they were logically provable. There are at least 5 moral facts. They're demonstrable by a philosophical method called reductio ad absurdum, which was developed by the ancient Greeks. All right, so there are 5 social rational necessities. If you want to have rationality at all, you need to have these 5 things. If you don't have these 5 things, then the entire world becomes irrational. First one, you need to have human beings around. You need to have rational decision makers. Maybe, there are aliens out there, maybe they can make reasoning too. But as far as we know, there are no aliens or other rational creatures in the world. So we need to assume that we are the ones carrying that burden. We need to exist. Humans need to exist, or else rationality has no foothold in the universe. The opposite means that rational agents don't exist, therefore no reasoning is possible. The next one is that you need to have a next generation, otherwise rationality disappears. That means that people need to have children. They also need to live sustainably. They need to live in a world where the environment will support us into the future. The third one there, we need to live in society. So reason requires language. We have to have other people to talk to. If you think of an individual baby, the baby will grow up, they will never talk. We have these terrible examples of children who are called feral humans. Somehow they've survived, but maybe no one's ever talked to them or things like that. They don't develop language on their own, and they become kind of permanently damaged because they have not had social contact. So we need social contact. We cannot live in isolation. Interpersonal communication makes reasoning possible. Fourth one, we need an educational system. We need to teach people that reasoning exists. We need to teach people how to reason. We need to teach people about science, logic, math, etc. Last one is to seek the truth. The opposite of not seeking the truth means that we ignore the truth. It's an impractical pursuit leading to death by ignoring reality, basically. You eat things that are not food, you fall off a cliff, or things like that. Now think about a baby once again. When a baby is going around, what do? They put their mouth on everything. They say, oh, is this edible? Is this food? What does this taste like? When a baby's doing that, they're determining true facts about the universe, which is that if I chew on, I don't know, this thing here, it's not food. It doesn't taste good. It feels bad on your mouth, whatever, like that. So we're seeking the truth. We're truth-seeking animals from the very, very beginning. And we actually recognize this, I would say, when it comes to AI ethics. There are the very fact that OpenAI and Anthropic and other organizations that are producing large language models, the very fact that they have the option of saying, no, I'm not going to answer your question, means that they know that truth exists, and actually that morality is connected to that truth. They're not going to tell you certain things. All right. So then how does this all connect to AI ethics? So the United Nations has Sustainable Development Goals. This chart, I apologize, is too small to see, but I'll just tell you that going down on one side, we have ethics principles from various companies. So we have OpenAI, we have Google, we have Salesforce, Microsoft, IBM, all going down that side over there. Across the top, we have those 5 fundamental principles I was talking about. All of the AI ethics principles fit into this chart somewhere, although there's one column that's empty, which is the education column. And as students at a university, or people who are at a university right now, we should recognize they're actually assuming something there. They're making an assumption that educated people will come and work for them. They're making that assumption that some other part of society works and that it provides education to people, and that that's not their responsibility. However, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes as to why actually this education question is something that they do need to be more concerned with. So all of their AI principles fall into this chart somewhere, although one column is empty. All of the UN human rights documents also can fall into this chart somewhere if you put them down as a list. All of the UN Sustainable Development Goals will fall into this chart somewhere. So what I'm saying is that humans we understand this practically, that these 5 values are necessary, and if we don't have them, then people die, bad things happen. But we don't necessarily acknowledge the theory behind it, the theory which is that, oh, this can be demonstrably proven by reason. All right. So what I would argue now then is that rationalism works and voluntarism does not work. The reason voluntarism does not work is because the world is not just one thing. If there were one person in the world, maybe you could say voluntarism works. But because everyone is out there and they disagree with each other, and we turn into cultures and governments and societies that then disagree with each other around the world, you end up having a competition to see who's stronger. It leads to this kind of race where two countries, for example, the United States and China, are now competing with each other when it comes to AI ethics. And they wonder who's going to be in charge, who's going to determine the future of the world. And that's because they're taking an understanding of ethics, which is that it's voluntarist. Whatever I say or whatever you say is going to be the future rules for the world. And so they fight with each other. So if you have many, many people competing, it can easily turn into totalitarianism. Once again, the might makes right idea. But rationalism permits peaceful agreement because it recognizes a higher power that's external to human beings. Once again, you can say that it's God, you can say that it's nature, you can say that it's logic or science or whatever you want to say it is. There is something that is external to human society that ultimately judges us or acts as something that tests us. You can think of evolution even if you want to. If you are a civilization and you choose something that is ultimately irrational, then evolution is going to select against your group. All right, so the cable here is meant to display kind of a metaphor. The cable shows the wires fraying. They don't agree with each other. They're following their own will. They're going separate ways. There are two ways to get the cable to go back together, right? You can clamp it together, you can force it, you can squeeze it or weld it or something like that. Or if you could argue with the pieces of metal, you could say, hey, pieces of metal go back together. It'll work better if you do that. The cable won't break. Society will continue to operate. Of course, you can't actually reason with metal, but that's why this is a metaphor. All right. And on the other side, there's thinking about the layers of society. There's an individual layer, the organizational layer, national layer, and then international. All right. We've gotten through the first half. So now we have part two. We need to go from theory to practice. And lots of people say that they have good ideas. However, there's reality out there that judges your ideas. Are your ideas actually good? If they don't work in reality, then they're not good. That's the fundamental scientific method. You try something and you see if it works. And what I would argue that we're doing right now with technology is that we're trying something with technology to see if it works. Can we actually have AI in society in a way that helps us? So reality tells you whether your ideas will work or not. It'll tell you if your idea is good or bad or true or false. How do you know if a theory is true? There are some things that you can do in advance. So it's one thing to experiment in the world. It's another thing to try to predict it in advance. And so there are various theories of truth. There's something called the coherence theory of truth. Does your idea make sense internally? The correspondence theory of truth, which is that does your idea make sense compared to reality? There's comprehensiveness. How much does your idea explain? Then there are consequences of believing this thing. If you believe this thing or do these things, do good things happen or bad things happen? All right. So one of the things we need to do with AI ethics is we need to learn from each other. So I have been working with the World Economic Forum for about 5 years now. I was the co-lead for the Responsible Use of Technology project at the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco. I'm now part of the World Economic Forum's AI Governance Alliance and a specific working group called Resilient Governance and Regulation. So the Responsible Use of Technology group produced 3 case studies. These case studies were on Microsoft, IBM, and Salesforce. And the purpose of those case studies was to look at what these organizations were already doing with technology. In other words, they were thinking about technology. They were also thinking about ethics. What's the right use of technology? The AI Governance Alliance is currently meeting to determine courses of action with AI. And when we look at companies, we learn from them, and then we think about how do we want to put that into reality. And thinking about specifically generative AI, so ChatGPT, art-producing AI, things like that. OpenAI had a huge announcement yesterday with GPT-4o, which was very multimodal. It had video, it had sound, it had audio, it had images, it had text. So all these things they brought together into one machine learning model. All right, and these studies, these case studies are available online. They're for free if you just look them up, Microsoft case study from the World Economic Forum, IBM, Salesforce. So these 3 corporations started their more intense ethics efforts when something went wrong. So Microsoft had a problem back in, I can't remember what year, maybe 2015 or 16. The chatbot called Tay came along. I don't know how many of you remember Tay, but they put Tay as a chatbot onto Twitter, and within a few minutes, Tay was saying all these terrible things because people were saying, hey, Tay, repeat after me, say this bad thing, and then Tay would say that thing. Microsoft shut it down. Then they said, okay, we're going to fix it. And the next day, they put it back up again. And almost as quickly as before, it started doing the same thing again. Then they shut it down again, and they said, okay, we need to think about this. Something went wrong. This made them recognize that their reputation was at stake when it came to the technology that they were producing. If they produced technology that did something bad, then it made them look bad as the organization that was producing it. That was kind of the inspiration for them to take ethics more seriously. With IBM, it was something called the gender shade study. The gender shade study looked at facial recognition software and discovered that it worked very well on light-skinned men, and it worked very badly on darker-skinned women. In particular, it was so bad that it would tend to misclassify black women, for example, Michelle Obama or Oprah Winfrey, you know, very famous black women. It would classify them as not a black woman, but as someone else. And so when IBM saw this, the study came out and they said, oh no, our facial recognition software is obviously very wrong, and it works well for some people, but not for others. This made them realize that they needed to take very seriously what they were doing with producing their products. They, once again, saw the reputational harm at stake. Salesforce had a similar incident. So at Salesforce was using their software, or giving their software rather, selling it to the Customs and Border Patrol of the United States. And when they were selling it to Customs and Border Patrol was then doing something where, during the Trump administration, they were separating families at the border, separating them into, men go one direction, women go another direction, and children go another direction. Some of those children are still not reunited with their parents. What the employees of Salesforce saw was they said, this seems to be a bad use of our technology. We're creating a technology that's then being used to do something bad. That seems a violation of our corporate values as an organization. So they wrote a letter to their CEO and said, we should stop doing this. We should not participate. And that made them think, okay, yes, we need to work harder to make sure that ethics is showing up in our products and how they're used. So they all redoubled their efforts to live their corporate values and strengthen their ethical climate. So all three corporations have explicitly stated values. They have a list of values that they say, we follow these 5 principles, or we follow these 6 principles, or however many principles it is. They don't just have the values as a statement, though. They have a way to implement them. You have to change the idea into an actual practice. It has to become something real in the organization. So the question becomes, how do we implement these things in an organization? They have paths for that. They say, this is going to be something that you're evaluated on. We're going to watch your behavior. We're going to make sure that you are rewarded for good behavior and punished for bad behavior. And that idea of reward and punishment of good and bad behavior is really crucial to ethics. If you reward bad behavior, then things get worse. People quickly learn that they should be acting badly. And if you punish good behavior, then people stop doing good things. Your society will start to fall apart if you follow this kind of rational or irrational reasoning. So all three corporations are also involved in multi-stakeholder initiatives. A multi-stakeholder initiative is something that brings many people together and gets them to talk about what's going on with their product and how it affects society. So it provides them a way to talk to civil society and say, this is what the technology is that we're developing, and it also gives them a chance to listen and have people say, hey, we've seen your technology is harming people, or we see how your technology is at putting one group of people at risk while it's benefiting another group of people. So it gives them a way to communicate out with society. This communication does happen, by the way. The communication will happen outside the multi-stakeholder initiative, but it will happen through newspapers and through media and other bad things happening. So the bad product will get out into society, then there's a newspaper article about it, or it ends up on the television or radio or YouTube or Twitter, and that is a form of communication. What the companies are trying to do is make sure that the communication happens before the bad thing happens. If they can talk to people more and get that information, then maybe the actual bad thing that gets in the newspaper can be prevented. All right, so this is a picture of Pope Francis. And you might think to yourself, what does Pope Francis have to do with any of this? Pope Francis is on one side of this picture, and I'm on the other side of the picture. So this was a conference that happened at the Vatican in 2019, in September. And Pope Francis is interested in technology ethics, and specifically AI. The reason he's interested in this as a topic is because he has had business leaders and technology leaders coming to him for almost 10 years now, saying, AI is a very powerful technology. Will you please do something? Will you say something so that people take the ethics of it seriously? And so he's been speaking out on this. You might every once in a while hear the Pope says something about AI. And it's not just him speaking out about it. He's also been working with organizations within the Vatican to promote this kind of thinking. So one of the things that the Pope does, the Pope is kind of like a king, and then all the cardinals around the king want to make the king happy. So the king says something like, hey, do something that talks about AI ethics. And then all the people around the king say, yes, well, we want to make the king happy. So whoever's in charge of these different organizations, for example, the Pontifical Academy for Life, they have been working on talking about AI as one of their major subjects. The organization that I work with at the Vatican is the Dicastery for Culture and Education. I've been working with them for about 5 years. The Pontifical Academy for Sciences thinks about AI from a scientific perspective. And a group of people called the Minerva Dialogues bring together tech leaders from Silicon Valley, brings them to Rome in order to talk about these issues of ethics and technology. And there are more besides that. So I've worked, as I said, with the Dicastery for Culture and Education, and before that, the Pontifical Council for Culture. It has two main AI initiatives. One of them is focused on industry, on the companies producing the technology, and one of them is focused on academia. So the academic side thinks about kind of the theoretical, what's the theoretical basis, the ethics, the anthropology, those sorts of issues, the psychology, sociology, all those sorts of issues. And the industry side thinks very much about the operationalization. How do you take an idea and make it real? How do you make it into something that works in the world? All right, so these are two outputs from the theoretical side of things. Back in 2022, we had a special issue of an academic journal that was talking about AI specifically. And then just last year in December, we published Encountering AI, which is about, it's a book-length analysis of basic ideas like, can AI be a person? Can AI be conscious? Can AI have relationships with human beings? What is AI going to do to society, to the military with artificial, lethal autonomous weapon systems? Or with, what is it going to do to the educational system? What is it going to do to employment? All these sorts of questions we put in there as an opening to the conversation. It's not meant to be a final word. It's meant to be an opening of a conversation so that you can read the book and say, I'm not sure I agree with that, or I think that this would be a better solution, or all those sorts of ideas. We're just putting them out there to start the conversation, to start thinking about these sorts of things. That's why it's an encounter with an idea. You see the idea, you look at it, you say, I like this idea, or I don't like this idea, or some of them I like and some of them I don't. So that's one initiative. Other initiatives would come from governments, for example. So there are lots of governments that are thinking about AI ethics. They're trying to make order out of chaos. If you can think about technology, once again, technology damages or it's disruptive to society. It causes confusion, it causes uncertainty, it damages trust. So governments want to repair that. They want to make sure that people trust society, they trust their government, they trust the media, trust corporations, things like that. So they're trying to make order out of chaos. The United Nations has initiatives on this. And the European Union has initiatives on this. The United States has been talking about this for a long time. Sometimes it actually does a little bit. China has a very strong sense of what they're doing with AI. They have a very coherent national strategy because they, ultimately they're much more a centralized form of government. California has rules about this. Singapore has rules about this. There are many, many other governments that are thinking about this kind of technology. And this is an international, multi-level effort. There's, of course, a trade-off that a government is always concerned with. Governments are concerned about, they want to have the innovation, they want to have good things happen, they want to have the technology, the economy progressing, they like the disruption, but the disruption is also a form of chaos, which then starts changing the social order. So there's this trade-off going back and forth, and you have to figure out what is the balance point. What is the acceptable amount of chaos that is okay, and what is the unacceptable amount that you want to regulate away? The point of regulation is to channel innovation towards good and move it away from what's bad. So once again, the first principle of practical reason, do good, avoid evil. You turn it into something that is legal in that way. And if there's a law about it, then hopefully that will actually cause people to act in the right way. They'll do the good thing and avoid the bad thing. Now, lots of people talk about the idea of stifling innovation. The actual point of regulation is to stifle innovation. It's to prevent people from trying to build a nuclear reactor in their basement or something like that. Every once in a while, somebody tries to gather a bunch of radioactive stuff together and build their own nuclear reactor. That's illegal. It's against the law because it creates this giant radioactive mess. That's not something that you should try to do in your basement. On the other hand, with computers, people do stuff with software all the time in their basement. That is actually encouraged by the government, unless you start doing something like hacking somebody, in which case somebody comes and knocks on your door and says, hey, we have been watching what you're doing, stop it, or we're going to make you stop it. All right, fourth step, never stop learning more things. There's always more to be thinking about. There are many multi-stakeholder initiatives, like I mentioned. There are many nonprofits with an interest in AI, whether they're academic. There's something called the Partnership on AI that brings together big technology companies and lots of groups from civil society. There's AAAI, which is the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. There's the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery. I won't go through all of these, but the basic idea is that they bring people together in order to talk about AI, to think about what are the right things to do with it, what's ethical, what's unethical, what's responsible, what's irresponsible. Of course, there's a lot of academic research on AI. There are big universities that are doing this sort of work, and there are also smaller universities too. So I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing at the Markkula Center. So one of the books that we just published also last year was called Ethics in the Age of Disruptive Technologies. There are specifically ethical tools for trying to organize this chaos. One of the things I say as an ethicist is that if everybody just chose to do the right thing voluntarily on their own as an individual, nothing bad would ever happen in the world, which is a strange idea, right? We know that this is not realistic. However, if think about that. That would be, the paradise world where everyone just chooses to do the right thing and nothing bad ever happens. Nobody ever chooses wrong. It's a free world where everyone's completely free. They always choose good. That world is unrealistic. It's not the world that we live in. So we have laws and we have regulations to make sure that people behave in certain ways. However, the more you can rely on ethics, the less law you have to have. And it actually gives you more freedom if you're more ethical. It gives you more freedom to do what you want to do because there are fewer laws that have to be made. So we have a framework for ethical decision-making that the Markkula Center produces. We have ethics and technology practice, which is another thing that we produce. We have the iTech handbook, which is the cover of the book that we see here, and then many, many more. So I'll just go into this for a little bit. We'll go a little bit quickly because we're getting close to the end now. So once again, we're thinking about constants and variables. And if we have constants turned into variables, we can turn them back into constants if we build trust, if we build ethics and laws around these things. So once again, in the past, we were involuntarily constrained. We did not have the power. We were not strong enough. We could not make certain choices. That's kind of like a physical control. Think of it as physics controlling what you can do. It's nature controlling you. Once we gain the power of technology, we've made nature work for us, basically. We say, nature, you're now going to work for us. And then we have to say, oh, but is this actually right or wrong? We have to be voluntarily constrained by our own judgment. And that gets the idea of ethics again, and our own freedom of choice. So ethics provides tools for good judgment, and legal codifications of ethical norms restore order by controlling variables to help build trust once again. It's rational and voluntary, but it's not voluntarist. So once again, making that distinction between rationalism and voluntarism. You want to have people freely following the true nature of reality, however you construe that to be, but it needs to be in accord with science and logic and mathematics and things like that. And it's voluntary. It's your own free choice that you're doing this. All right. It'll be ethical and legal control, not a physical control. And it's also an empowering form of control. It gives people more freedom so that they can make choices themselves. It's not a disempowering control. If you think about a more centralized society, for example, a centralized government or a more totalitarian or authoritarian government will try to control its citizens very heavy-handed techniques. You know, there will be constant surveillance, there will be secret police, all sorts of bad things that we can imagine, and we don't have to imagine. We can look at history and look at the world right now around us and see how these other nations operate. That heavy-handed, disempowering control makes the central government more powerful, but it disempowers all of the people. And it also, by doing that, it makes people afraid to do things. You don't want to have innovation. You don't want to try new things because you never know if the government is going to attack you for doing that new thing. All right. So the Markkula Center has a framework for ethical decision making. All these resources are available for free online. So you can just look them up if you want to. If you look up the framework for ethical decision making from the Markkula Center, you'll see this, but laid out, more verbally. This is the more graphical depiction of it. First thing, I won't go through all these letters or all these words. There's too much there. But there are basically 5 steps. First, you recognize an ethical issue. You see that you are in an ethical situation. A lot of the times, people don't see that they are in an ethical situation. They don't recognize that they have a choice in front of them. Once you recognize that there is a choice, then you need to get the facts about it. What is true, what is false? You can think about a courtroom. Any sort of courtroom has a judge, and it has a jury, and it has, you call witnesses, you get evidence, you bring all these people together, and you try to figure out what is true, what is false. Once you have all that evidence, then you evaluate it from different perspectives. Human rights, justice perspective, utilitarian perspective, common good perspective, virtue ethics perspective, and then the care ethics perspective. And it's important to come at it from all those perspectives because everybody in the world has their own favorite way of looking at the world. If you think very relationally and caring about people, then you'll come from the care ethics perspective. If you think in terms of cost-benefit analysis, then you're thinking more in terms of utilitarianism. Some people think more in terms of human rights or justice or virtue ethics. What kind of a person, what's a good person look like? How do I become a good person and avoid being a bad person? You need to think about those things because everybody has a different perspective, like I said. If you choose only one, then it turns out a lot of people will not understand what you're doing and will probably disagree with you. So you want to make sure you come up with a solution that is widely understandable in terms of its ethical foundations. Then you make a decision and you test it. You think to yourself, if I chose this, then what would happen? Will people say I'm a good person? If it ends up on Twitter or on the news, are people going to agree with my choice or will they disagree with it? And then you want to act and reflect on the outcome. Can you learn from that? Can you make a better choice in the future based on what you learned? All right. Ethics and technology practice is a set of tools that the Markkula Center produced specifically for engineers and for technology developers. So this is just a picture of the website itself. It includes the framework for ethical decision making that we just talked about. Then it has a toolkit of ethics, and I'll talk a little bit about those tools. It has case studies, it has sample design workflow also. But the ethical toolkit, the idea behind that is that there are 8 different tools here. As someone is developing technology, they want to think bigger. They want to expand the ethical circle. Premortems and postmortems. Postmortem is when something goes wrong and you say, okay, how did this happen? How did this bad thing happen? A premortem takes that idea and says, what could go wrong here? And how do we prevent that from happening before anything bad actually happens? Case-based analysis looks at a technology and says, what are some similar cases to this in the past? Ethical risk sweeping looks out and says, what could go wrong? What are the risks that we need to worry about? Remembering the ethical benefits. I like to think about, once again, if you use the navigation metaphor, then you are driving a car from one place to another. Ethics is like the steering wheel and the brake pedal and the gas pedal. Most of the time people talk about ethics and they say, no, 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 that's the brake pedal, right? If your car only has a brake pedal and a steering wheel, you never get anywhere. There is actually something good that you're aiming for with ethics. That's the gas pedal. You're aiming towards something good. You do need to push the gas pedal to get there. But you need to also use the brakes and the steering wheel. If you just push the gas pedal and you have no brake pedal, you're going to crash. If you just have a gas pedal and you have no steering wheel, you're going to crash. You need all 3 of those in order to make ethics work. Another tool that's on there is think about the terrible people. So every time a new technology is put out there, terrible people start to abuse it. We've seen this with social media, with a prime example, misinformation, propaganda, very bad content a lot of the times. And then the last one is closing the loop. Think all the way back to the beginning. Is there a way to improve what you've done? All right. So iTech has a multi-layered set of principles. Once again, think about navigation. The primary principle is you say you want to get where you're going. You have a good goal that you're aiming for. Then you get more specific, and then even more specific, and then very, very specific down at the bottom. So the anchoring principle for the iTech initiative, for the iTech book, is that our actions are for the common good of humanity and the environment. So you're thinking the good of everyone, all of society, and the environment. That then gets split down into many principles. So we have 7 principles that we look at. They're mostly fairly standard. I'm going to look at just one of these principles right now, and that is recognizing that Earth is for all life. So if we think about Earth being for all life, then we try to get more specific. What does that mean that Earth is for all life? So the specifying principles that are under that guiding principle are that we want to pursue environmental sustainability, we want to facilitate biodiversity, we want to make sure that we're taking action that helps the climate, and remember that Earth is fundamentally shared with all life. It's not just humans on Earth, there's also other life forms out there. All right, and some of these sample action principles, when you get to the action principles, there are too many. They have to apply to every single situation. If you're thinking about driving, these would be the things like avoid the pothole that's right in front of you, or don't crash into a tree. So they get very specific. They're so specific that you can't list them all out in a book. You have to come up with them in the specific situation as you reach it. So maybe you want to track energy and water usage related to AI systems. Maybe you want to use AI only when it's very high impact and the environmental impact is justifiable. You want to invest in AI systems that are low power requirements or low computational requirements. You want to have server facilities with low carbon footprints and disclosing energy and water usage. That way, you're thinking about the very specific things that are happening with your technology. All right. We also have a 5-step process that you go through as a corporation. So one of the things we learned from working with companies is that this is the kind of process that they go through. It's kind of a process that they do in practice. They work it out, but they didn't have a theory behind it. So the very first step is you need to get the leadership on board. The CEO and the board of directors need to be on board. Number 2, you need to assess the culture of the organization. Are people acting ethically in the organization already? Then think about tech governance. Then think about how to implement this process, and then do continuous improvement. And this is the diagram that we have in the book that we share with everyone. So once again, 5-step process. Step 4 has 2 parts to it. That's why it's split at that point. One direction is directed towards human resources and culture, and one is directed towards product development. Once again, thinking of this as like a roadmap or a navigation problem. The first thing you have to do is decide that you want to go on a journey. You want to go somewhere. Next thing you need to choose, you need to figure out where you are. That's step number 2. What's your location? Because sometimes it's not clear what your location is. Number 3 is that you find the destination where you want to go. Step 4 is that you figure out how to get there. What is the path that you take? And then step 5 is continuous improvement. All right, we have a few slides left and we're running out of time. This is just something about generative AI, which is that these previous pictures were made with generative AI, but they were made with Adobe Firefly. Adobe Firefly legally licenses those pictures in the database that goes into their product to make sure that there's no question about lawsuits that will appear. There have been lots of lawsuits from the New York Times and from artists and from other people saying you stole our data to train your AI. All right, so leadership, discernment, and direction. We'll just go very fast now. Basically, you decide that you want to do something. And here's an example from the CEO of Accenture, who said every time she meets with a CEO, she asks them, do you have a person who is responsible for responsible AI? Who is that person? And right now, most CEOs do not have that person. All right, then you do an ethical culture assessment. This is something that my co-author, Ann Skeet, has specialized in, which is to look at the culture of an organization and figure out exactly what their culture is like there. All right, the responsible technology governance framework. This is too much. I should say, once again, the entire iTech handbook is free online. It's meant to be a resource that you can just download and look at as you need it. So this is about the destination. This is about the implementation in terms of mindset, culture, system planning. And it has 2 parts to it. So one of them is the HR side of things. One of them is the product side of things. Then lastly, continuous improvement. Make sure that you're improving over time. All right, this is almost the last slide. So what are the conclusions? What's the summary of what we talked about? We've looked at the theory, trying to understand reality, and then we've looked at the practical side of things. We've gone all the way from the idea of what technology does to culture, why does it damage trust, what is going on there with turning constants into variables, and talking about navigating from one place to another. We talked about the first principle of practical reason and those 5 necessities and the idea of voluntarism or rationalism when it comes to ethics. And then learning. We go to corporations, we learn and see what they're doing. We go to religious groups, see what they're thinking about. Governments, learn from everyone who has these powers, and then give back ultimately. What can you give back that can maybe start pulling these ideas together, a coherent unity? These are some of the links right here if you want to go to the framework or ethics and technology practice or the iTech resources. And now we are all done. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear some questions.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the information.
Buenos
I have a
días.
question regarding
Muchas gracias
evaluation
por la
through
información.
ethical avances.
Tengo
Where does the limit
una
of
pregunta acerca de la
subjectiveness
evaluación.
lie?
¿Dónde
And
está
also,
el
which is the
límite
limit
de la
for
subjetividad
negotiating
y cuál es el
in
límite
this
para
part of
negociar
ethical avances?
en esta
Where is the
parte
limit
de los
for us
de la
to,
ética y cuál es el límite para que nosotros
to let other people influence us?
dejemos que otras
And
personas no tengan
how-
una influencia sobre
How
nosotros,
far can we go
nosotras
when
y qué
influencing
tan
other
lejos
people in
podemos
order
ir
to
al
negotiate?
influenciar a otras.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. When we're talking about ethical lenses, like I was saying, we had 6 different ethical lenses for way to look at the world. And how much should they influence each other? How much should we let other people influence our decision-making process? The answer is that's very hard to answer in the abstract. It really depends on the situation. So if you had, let's look at this sort of situation right now. When OpenAI created ChatGPT, they made cheating so easy in schools that it was like they devastated the school system. And OpenAI was not, they didn't seem to really care about this. They didn't seem to notice that there was a problem. They didn't seem to appreciate what a big change they had caused in the world. But from the outside, lots of people looked at it from these different perspectives. They said, I can't trust my students anymore. This is, and that's a terrible feeling if you're a professor and you feel like you cannot trust your students. That also damages the relationship from the student perspective. The student, now you feel alienated, like, why does my professor not trust me anymore? So that comes at it from kind of the care ethics perspective. It's a damaged relationship. Think about also the common good. If for example, all the students in the world started cheating using AI for 10 years, that would destroy the entire world, right? It'd be like weapon of mass destruction on the entire educational system. The entire world will collapse in very, just like a decade. If you start thinking about it from cost-benefit analysis, from the utilitarian perspective, you see the same thing in terms of how that is very much a cost on the world. It's a benefit to the corporation, but it puts this huge externalized cost on the rest of the world. Virtue ethics would ask a question like, would a good person do this? How does a good person respond to this technology? And of course, a good person would not cheat on their assignments and things like that. A good person tries to trust as much as they can to restore that relationship and maintain it. If you look at it from the justice perspective, you'd say it's unjust to cheat in class or things like that. All these different perspectives get out. Oh, and also the human rights perspective. Are there human rights involved here? Well, there's a human right to education, so we want to make sure that we're protecting the educational system so that everyone can have that right. All of which is to say that you can't answer it in the abstract. However, if you get into one specific case like that, you might notice that every single lens agrees that this was a bad implementation of the technology. And if every single lens agrees, then there's no problem, right? Then it's very obvious that there was a mistake made and it should have been implemented better. When they do start disagreeing with each other, that's when it becomes difficult. And these disagreements do happen. And like I said, you have to get into the specifics of the situation. You need to talk to lots of people, talk to people you trust, people you think have good judgment, and bring that all together, and ultimately you have to make the decision on your own.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes.
Hi,
Quiero
good
saber
afternoon.
respecto
I would
al tema de la
I would
ética
like to
junto a la
know
inteligencia
about
artificial.
the
Me gustaría
ethics
saber su
in
opinión
terms of
sobre
the
aquellas empresas que
AI
prefieren darle la
and what's your
oportunidad a
opinion about those
programadores que
companies
puedan hacer con
that
inteligencia
give
artificial el
opportunities to
trabajo de
programmers or
personas que pueden hacerlo
developers that
con
work
que
using
mediante su
AI
oficio
and they do
de
jobs that
principal. No
formerly
sé
were
cómo
done
usted lo
by
pueda
people. So I
relacionar
don't
o
know how you
qué está
can
bien, qué está
relate
mal
this. I
en
mean,
ese
is it
tema.
wrong?
Gracias.
Is it good?
Yeah, this is a really important question. AI is going to change jobs. It's going to make certain jobs. It's going to make perhaps one person become 10 times as effective. And if you have 10 people doing the same job, and then one person can do the job of 10 people, then 9 people need to find something else to do. The ideal thing that a company would do in this situation would be to train those 9 employees to teach them to do a new job. And therefore, that efficiency that you get from the one person doing 10 people's job, those other 9 people can then also be just as efficient. So that you have 10 people doing the work of 100 people, and you just become, overall, all of society can become more efficient. But we also know that society doesn't really operate that way. That instead what the company often does is it will lay people off and say, you don't have a job anymore. This is where it becomes really important for us to think about how to train people for this new world that we're creating. One of the things that I have been talking about with people recently is that why is it that children go to school, right? Why is it that starting, at age, 5, 6, 7 years old, you start putting the child in school, and they stay in school maybe all the way through university, and then the school stops. There's no more university. You're done. The idea is that's for a world that does not change. Once you learn everything about the world in school, you don't need to learn anything else. You're done. You're set for the rest of your life. That's not the way the future is going to work. If the world is constantly changing because of technology, then what we have to do is we have to make sure that there's some way to keep educating adults. If the world keeps changing, they need to understand how the world is changing and how they need to adapt to it. Whether it would be in an employment site with a company, whether it needs to be through adult education at a university, whether it needs to be through, I don't know, YouTube or something like that, watching YouTube videos to learn things. This is how people learn things right now, right? It's not all true. A lot of it's bad stuff, actually, or waste of time. Or maybe the government needs to work on some sort of initiative to help people have adult education. There's also the media. Think about what newspapers and television and all those other media sources do. They're a form of education for adults. We really need to think about these other ways of educating adults to make sure that we can be prepared. But really, when it comes back to your question, unemployment question is a real question, and we all need to be prepared for the future to be different in this way. One thing I would say is that certain types of employees are always desirable. An employee who's honest, who's reliable, who's always ready to do the right thing, those sorts of things are valuable, and it's you as a human being. You're not replaceable if you're a human being who's actually a good human being that people want to work with. If you're happy on the job site, they'll try to keep you there, right? They want to keep you around. So what I would say is, just become the best employee that you can. It might not work all the time, but it'll at least work a lot of the time. And hopefully, if you need to find another job, then you'll be able to find one.
Me gustaría que nos comentara cuáles son entonces los principales retos que faltan por resolver en materia de ética y de inteligencia artificial, si es necesario crear un consenso mundial como para que todos sigan exactamente estas mismas definiciones y estos mismos patrones, y cómo las universidades como la UNAM pueden aportar pues ideas o aportar nuevas estrategias para alcanzar justamente esas metas.
Yeah, this is a really important question. The ideal situation is that everyone in the world, like I said, is free to do the right thing. They're free to make all the choices they can, and they just choose to do the right thing. We know that's not a real world. That's not the real world. And so people in different places will have different governments, and the governments will not agree with each other. Right now, we already see this with technology. Every country has different rules about technology, and so every technology company has to try to follow the rules in that country. So if you're within a designated geographic area, different rules apply than if you're in a different place. The future is probably going to look like this for a while, but as the experiment is ongoing, as we're doing this social experiment with technology, then we will discover some ways that work better than others. If you are in a society where, for example, everything's becoming chaotic or there's misinformation everywhere and nobody knows what's true or false anymore, other countries are going to look at you and say, oh, don't follow that example, negative example, don't follow it, don't do that. If things are going really well in the country, then you say, oh, that's a good example, let's follow that example. The nice thing to be able to do is, could we, from the very beginning, try to make the best choices that we can? And that's why I presented those 5 ideas: the survive, reproduce, live in society, educate the young, seek the truth. Those are 5 things that if you keep in mind, you're more likely to make better choices at the start. Every country will probably follow those slightly differently, and they might not even recognize that they're following those rules. They might just be saying something like, we don't like misinformation, we're banning misinformation. That's following the idea of truth, but it's not going all the way up to the abstract level of determining it. They're just making it as a decision, hey, falsehood in society is bad. Or they might have something like, we don't want AI to kill everybody, like in the Terminator movie. You know, let's make a law against that. You almost don't need to make that law, right? Everybody understands they don't want that to happen. On the other hand, there are probably people who are try to build something like that. There are military, people who say, hey, that looks like a good idea, let's do that. So we have this constant balancing act between avoiding these crazy bad things that could happen and trying to pursue these good and reasonable ideas of what the future will look like. And once again, let's try to make the best choices we can right now, but as we explore the future, then we will get data, from the experiment itself in the real world.
I have a question about, I have 2 questions. First one, are you aware of
Preguntas.
ChatGPT's
La
newer model that
primera,
was announced
¿conoces
yesterday,
el nuevo modelo de
ChatGPT
ChatGPT que se anunció ayer,
And
ChatGPT
my question goes,
4.0? Y mi pregunta
do you think
es,
this is going
¿crees
to-
que esto va,
following up the question that
y siguiendo
my
la pregunta que
fellow
hizo
asked, is,
mi colega,
is it going to replace not only
va a
data analysts, but
reemplazar
teachers?
no
And do you think it's
solo a
dangerous that we're
quizás
not
a los
giving ChatGPT
profesores,
the
y será
option to see
peligroso
things
que
and
no
to
le,
hear
di-
things, and
que no le demos la opción a
well,
ChatGPT de que
it
vea
seems like
cosas y
OpenAI
escuche
is aiming
cosas,
to make ChatGPT have its own
y,
personality
y
and
se está
changing the
buscando
way
que
he
ChatGPT
speaks
tenga
to
su
us
propia
in
personalidad,
different
cambiando la
tonalities, and
forma en que
do you
nos habla
think
con
this
diferentes
overweights the,
tonos.
well,
¿Cree usted
regarding your
que
presentation
en
where
relación
we
con su
think about,
presentación
the benefits,
y que
benefit
pensamos
cost,
acerca de la
do you
relación
think it
costo-beneficio,
outweighs,
crees que aquí se sobrepase
the dangers outweighs
los peligros que
the
sean
benefits of
mayores a
society?
los beneficios para la sociedad?
So yes, I am aware of it. I haven't tried it yet, so I haven't experimented with it personally, but I've heard that it is out there, and the announcement happened, and it is very capable and has these very many different modalities that it works in, whether it's audio, visual, text, listening to you, speaking back to you, all these sorts of things. It raises really interesting questions, like you just said. Is this actually a good idea? Are we just replacing ourselves with AI? And this is one of the ideas that's in the background, right? Which is that we're taking all of our mental ideas, everything that we can think of, we're externalizing it into an outside object, and then we're making that object maybe better than a human being. And then we think to ourselves, well, what's left for me as a human being? Is there anything special about me as a human being? The answer is, of course, that there is something very special about you as a human being. Human beings are very different from AI. Every time AI has a new power, we should think to ourselves, once again, it's imitating us, right? It's an imitation. It's not fundamentally that GPT 4.0 is thinking. It doesn't think. What it does is it makes associations, and it makes associations based on a lot of evidence of human activity that it gathered in from the outside world. By gathering that information together, it then can roughly approximate what a human would do in that situation. But it's not a human being, it's an imitation of a human being. The important thing about real human beings is that they're real, they're not imitations. All of you are real human beings, and you're not replaceable. If you tried, let's say you made a robot of yourself, and you sent your robot home to hug your mom, your mom's not going to be happy about the robot coming to hug her instead of you, right? It's a poor imitation. There might be some circumstances where that would make sense, right? If your job is to clean up radioactive waste or something like that, sending a robot in instead of a person is a much better solution. On the other hand, in any type of family relationship, and think about children once again. Can you imagine children being raised by robots? That seems like a really dystopian world. It looks like a bad future that we don't want. We're already seeing this, however, with care of the elderly. People are thinking about how do we automate care of the elderly, or how do we automate a hospital? That's really dehumanizing in a lot of ways when you start saying that that human connection of healthcare is not important. So I think there are some specific areas that have to do with what human beings are like. We're embodied people. We have, specific relationships that we have to fulfill, like our obligations in our families and with our friends and things like that. We're not replaceable in that way. The thing about those relationships is that you don't get paid for them, right? So you can't necessarily say, hey, I'm being a really good son, would you give me more money? Or, hey, I'm being a really good parent, would you give me some money back because I just gave you money? That's not the way those relationships work, and they should not work that way. So then the question is, if all of this type of labor that can be automated by machines becomes automated, how do we have an economy anymore? So people talk about universal basic income, or they talk about other ways of trying to support people to give them all the needs that they need. And you can think about Star Trek. You know, the economy in Star Trek is all about replicators, right? You can just make whatever you want to anytime. It's difficult to think what the future is actually going to look like economically speaking, but we know that we have to think about this really hard. We're going to be running the experiment. We're going to encounter difficulties along the way, and what can we do to try to make sure that we're creating a future that's really pro-human, right? Ultimately, that technology is serving us as human beings and not us serving the technology.
Hi, good morning.
Hola, buenos días.
I have a question about
Tengo una pregunta
the governments
sobre
have any kind
los
of regulation
gobiernos.
or
¿Tienen
limits
algunas
about the use of the
regulaciones o
artificial
límites
intelligence?
sobre el uso de la inteligencia?
Yes, there are some government regulations about AI, but it depends a lot on where you are. So for example, let's see, what would be an example of this? In China, for example, there are a lot of regulations that involve technology. For example, children cannot play video games more than a certain number of hours per day or a certain number of hours per week. And if they're watching TikTok videos, the TikTok videos that they get are educational instead of, mindless entertainment or propaganda or whatever kind of, TikTok videos you're getting outside of China. So that's not necessarily a regulation of AI, but it is a regulation of technology. And one thing I would say is that a lot of regulation of AI comes from pre-existing laws. So for example, we have rules about how products are supposed to exist in the world. Self-driving cars are not supposed to crash. If the car crashes, somebody has to be at fault for that. Right now, if you're driving a self-driving car, first of all, it's not self-driving, that's not the right word for it, but they market it that way with marketing. And so if the car crashes, the driver has already signed a very, very long consent form, a book-long end-user license agreement. Everybody ignores the user license agreement. The user license agreement for a Tesla says that if the car crashes on autopilot mode, it's still your fault. It's not Tesla's fault. So right now, that has stood up in court. Maybe in the future that won't stand up in court. There might be a legal lawsuit about it. So right now, the law already applies in that way. You sign a contract, the contract applies. So there are some rules that already apply. When you're getting into deeper issues like content moderation on the internet, or control of propaganda, or limitations on freedom of speech, those sorts of things in terms of misinformation, there's going to be a huge problem with misinformation coming up just because generative AI can produce so much information. We could make more fake things in the world than there are real things. Then we won't know what's real or not. In that case, in the United States in particular, the United States First Amendment says freedom of speech. Other countries don't have that First Amendment, so they might be able to deal with the problem more easily. Freedom of speech includes things that are not true. It does not cover things like threats or things that could endanger human life or things like that. So it's understood that there is a priority in the way the rights work. But freedom of speech is a very high priority right in the United States. And that includes, like I said, saying things that are misinformation, disinformation, things that are false. So the United States is going to have a problem here trying to figure out how to navigate that legally. And of course, these problems show up in all sorts of other places too.
Buenos días, doctor y
Good morning.
compañeros. Mi pregunta
My
sería la
question
siguiente,
is the
y es
following
¿cómo
one.
podría una inteligencia
How
artificial
can
determinar de
the
manera
artificial
autodidacta
intelligence
un concepto del bien y del mal
in a
si constantemente un agente externo le prohíbe
way a
determinados
concept about
comportamientos?
good and
So this is interesting. Um, the first thing I would say is that when we think about AI, we should think about AI as being a tool and not a person, right? It's not like there's a person there who needs to learn right from wrong. So in that case, it's not like there's an entity. It's a tool. It's a very large statistical model. It's a lot of math that's associating words with each other. At the same time, we can think to ourselves, there was a point in the past where we were associating words as babies, and we eventually learned how language worked. At the same time, people said, don't say that, or do say this, be polite, say thank you, say please, don't say bad words. And so it does have a certain amount of reinforcement learning to it. When a human is learning, we have this outside stimulus that's telling us how to behave. And it's the same thing with artificial intelligence. There's an outside human training that goes on there with reinforcement learning with human feedback. The reason they went down the path of reinforcement learning with human feedback is because they determined that the data set that they were collecting off the internet, there was no way to remove bias from it. No matter what they did, they could not make the bias from the internet not racist, not sexist, not discriminatory in some unfair, unjust way. And so, because they could not make a perfectly ethical data set, they had to come up with another way to make the AI actively anti-racist, actively anti-sexist, anti-discriminatory, and that's why the human feedback had to come into it. So I think we should think to ourselves how it is analogous to human learning in that way, right? We're constantly responding to the outside world and either being approved of or disapproved of. And so the AI model has that same kind of thing applied to it. But it's going to be interesting in the future because you're right, they are trying to make this type of self-learning happen. As the self-learning happens, it'll be interesting to see if it can better internalize these sorts of ideas so that it doesn't have to be actively have this reinforcement learning applied to it from the outside. So I think that is an interesting technical question.